Last week, we looked at this amazing theme from the book of 1 Corinthians that is echoed throughout the scripture, but comes supremely in Jesus Christ, where he communicates to us to love everyone always. This challenging and revolutionary message from Jesus is a message that comes to us and questions all of our presuppositions about how we live life and how we orient ourselves to one another. Jesus says, love everyone always. Love even your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. I count 3,500 verses in the scripture telling us to love, calling us to compassion, encouraging us to care, to demonstrate love and justice and goodness and kindness. And when you look at the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul makes his entire theme living the life of love. In his concluding remarks, he tells us, do everything, whatever you do in word or deed, do it all with love. He tells us there's many things that are important: faith, hope, love, but the greatest of these is love. And last week in our introduction to this book of 1 Corinthians, we saw that Jesus is the very embodiment of God's love to the world. And that when we come to Jesus, then we come to the very hope and help for living a loving life. Paul says, don't let anything keep you from him. Now, I was talking with a father this past week who said, I'm not a Bible scholar. I don't know how to read the Bible, but I want to be a more loving husband. I want to be a better father. But sometimes I feel like I don't know enough. Well, what Paul tells us in chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians is a great response to this father who spoke to me this past week. Because in this text, Paul tells us it's not so much in what you know. Worldly wisdom is different than the power of God. And then he goes on to tell us how to access the very power of God. Worldly wisdom has its limits. Do you realize that? Worldly wisdom, Paul tells us in our text, is not the thing that can really take us to the place of love and joy that God has for us. And Paul expresses this when he says in verse 2, I am determined to tell you nothing and to know nothing but Jesus. And Paul's a smart guy. And yet he tells us, I want to just focus on Jesus. There's limits to intellect and to eloquent speech. There's limits to philosophy and oration. He could do these mental gymnastics if he wants to, but Paul realizes that for us to come to a place of living a life of love, it's not about worldly wisdom. Our faith and hope needs to be in nothing less than Jesus' blood and his righteousness. And that's the power of God. No worldly wisdom will do that. No worldly wisdom makes us a better person. If that were true, wouldn't the smartest person be the kindest person? If worldly wisdom could make us better people, then the smartest person in the room is always going to be the most loving. And we know that's not true. I know somebody, talking to them this past week, they were telling me that they go and visit doctors every day, all day long. They go to a doctor's office, and then to another doctor's office, and to another doctor's office. Now, I think most of us would say doctors are among the smartest people in our community, right? Right? All you doctors. The only people that didn't say right are the women sitting next to the doctors or the man sitting next to the doctor. But doctors are among the smartest among us. And so this woman says she goes into these doctor's offices every day. And I said, how is that for you? She says, doctors, she said, are among the nicest people I have ever met. That's true. She said that. And she also said that some doctors are among the most haughty, nasty people she's ever met. I think you could probably say the same thing about any profession, couldn't you? I mean, I look at this church. We're filled with PhDs and MDs and DDs and MAs and MSs and BSs and BAs. I mean, if you go around this room and you meet all the various people, we're just filled with fascinating people. And I think you're pretty nice. But is it your education that makes you nice? Is it your intellect that makes you nice? I've also been to some great churches in Latin America and in Africa. And there's not a single person there in the church that has an advanced degree. But there's some wonderful, nice people. It's not the smarts that make us better people. I think that the preacher D.L. Moody is really in the spirit of Paul in the way that he would preach. He said that he preached not with worldly wisdom, but with the power of God. And common people would come to Christ by the thousands. And if you know much about D.L. Moody, he was one of the greatest evangelists of the later part of the 19th century. And people would come to Christ, and one of his supporters got him an invitation to Cambridge University. And he was going to speak in the Cambridge chapel. And that was back in the days when all the students were required to go to chapel. They don't do that at Redlands any longer, or at many universities around the country, but all the students were forced to go. Your name was checked off, you had your assigned seats. And a lot of the scholars, young scholars who were there, were pretty disappointed that they had invited this kind of backwood preacher from America with very little education to come and speak in their chapel. I mean, why would they have this uneducated person come to the seat of powerful intellect for the Western civilization? Why would they do that? And one of the young scholars there said that he had heard that D.L. Moody even pronounced the word Jerusalem with one single syllable. That was the rumor. How could this person that is not eloquent of speech come? And another fellow was very disappointed when he stood up there, and he said he slaughtered the king's English. He started his speech saying, "Young gentlemen, how is it that you in any way could not believe that God loves you? Don't let anybody tell you that God doesn't love you, for he do." And most everybody in the room was just put off by the way that he spoke. And he continued to talk and share with passion about the difference that Christ makes in one's life. And as he shared, he repeated his theme, don't let anybody tell you that God don't love you, because he do. And then as he spoke, people began to be moved by not so much his eloquence, but by his passion for Jesus and by the compelling message of Christ's power in his life. And after the service, one of the young scholars goes up and asks D.L. Moody to share with him more. And Moody then shared together with that young scholar a prayer, led him to a living relationship with Christ, where he dedicated his heart to Jesus. In the midst of doing that, he then became an Anglican priest. That was the furthest thing from his mind. Don't ever tell yourself or let anybody tell you that God don't love you, for he do. It's not an eloquent message, but it's the truth. And Paul says, I have come to you not with eloquence. And like I said, he's a smart guy. This is not to say that the Christian message is an anti-intellectual message. It's not. Social psychologists who have done historical study of the great intellects of history have done assessments of various individuals' writings, and they'll place the writings of the Apostle Paul right next to Aristotle and Socrates. He had a mind like Leonardo da Vinci or like Isaac Newton. This guy was as capable in his thoughts as a Thomas Jefferson or a Benjamin Franklin. And yet, for him, it was not so much about the power of worldly wisdom, but about the power of God that can transform us and make us into loving individuals. I mean, think of the power that you are impressed with in life. I think the 20th century has been a century of great science. And as we've moved into the 21st century, we've seen the expansion of vast technology. And when I think of the past 100 years, perhaps the most powerful individual that really personifies the power of worldly wisdom, I think is written about by the authors Merwin and Bird, Kai Bird, and a fellow named Merwin. They wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, in fact, that they titled American Prometheus. You know who that was about? Robert Oppenheimer. Like the Greek god, soared to the sun to steal fire from the gods and bring it back to earth. And in their book, they describe the brilliance of Robert Oppenheimer, not just his intellect, and I don't think that we're aware of this, but his social and relational and organizational brilliance as well. Because he used his vast brilliance and multiple intelligences to work together with General Graves to present to the world, through the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. It was the epitome of worldly wisdom in the mid part of the 20th century. And then Sherwin and Bird discuss in the second half of the book all about how Oppenheimer spent the second half of his life trying to undo all the work that he'd been doing in the first half of his life. Because he saw the dangers of the runaway proliferation of nuclear weaponry that had been caught up in what Dwight Eisenhower called the vast military-industrial complex. And he worked so hard, realizing that it's not worldly wisdom that advances us as a humanity. It takes something more. Worldly wisdom can create the power of the atom at our fingertips, but it also can bring us to war and to hate and to the possible annihilation of humanity. We all have seen the benefits of worldly wisdom in helping us understand our human condition, and yet at the same time, it can be used for great damage. And Paul's concerned about this in the church in Corinth because he's gotten reports from Chloe's people that they were not living the life of love after the Spirit of God, like Jesus had called them to. You know Chloe's people? Do you have your people? Paul had his people. Chloe's people. We don't know much about Chloe's people, and we don't know much about Chloe, but we do hear from Paul that he'd been given this image of what was going on in Corinth. And these people that had been transformed by the very living power of Christ's Spirit, had then turned to a life of division and dissension and not very loving. And so here in chapter 2 of Paul's letter, he gives us an alternative vision for how to live the life of love. And two pictures he presents for us. First of all, he presents for us an image of the power of the cross. He says the cross seems like foolishness to humans, but it represents the power of God. Now, I think it's important for us to understand what he's saying when he's talking about the cross. As Christians in the 21st century, we look at a beautiful cross that's nicely lit before us in the sanctuary. Women have crosses as jewelries. We see crosses on steeples across the country. And yet when Paul talks about the cross, in the first century setting, the cross was not an image of beauty, but it was an image of shame and rejection and death. If you want to gain a better image of what Paul is talking about in sharing with the first century Christians this image of the cross, just think of an electric chair. Imagine an electric chair hung on the wall with the straps on the side. Or as you drive around the country, think of an electric chair hanging on the top of steeples. That's the modern equivalent of the kind of power and imagery that Paul is providing when he talks about the cross. It's a symbol of death and of sacrifice. And for Paul, it was the death of Jesus Christ that was the preeminent symbol of God's love to the world. For God so loved the world that Jesus gave his life for us, so that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And that was the extreme expression, the ultimate expression for Paul of the kind of love God has. And worldly wisdom is a kind of wisdom that was one that would puff up an individual and help them feel proud and boastful. But the wisdom of God was the wisdom of the cross, and this alternative vision that Paul shared together with them is the vision that he wanted them to have, so that instead of being puffed up, they would be willing to die to themselves in order to live in care and love for others. Now, that's the first image that Paul provides for us. He also provides a second image in painting an alternative picture that came from Chloe's people. The alternative image is an image of the Spirit. And for Paul, we have a spirit, and God has a spirit. Our spirit searches us. The spirit of the human goes within the deeper recesses of our internal being and looks at everything that's inside and all around us. My wife and I were out hiking at Caroline Park. Any of you ever go up to Caroline Park? We were up there the other day, my wife and Lewis, our dog, and we were walking through the various trails, and as we're walking on the trails, we take all these various little detours on these trails that have brush and trees hanging over. And then as we went on many of the pathways, we would see little posts with numbers by a tree. And I thought, whoa, I wonder what that little number indicates. I want to get the guide for those numbers. Any of you have the guide for those numbers? I want to talk to you, because I'd like to know what those trees are. And it's like the spirit of the human, my spirit, goes through the trails of my interior recesses and sees everything that is there. All the joy and successes, but also the pain and the heartache and the shame and the brokenness. And then there's the Spirit of God. And the Spirit of God searches the very depths of God. And what does the Spirit of God see at every twist and at every turn within the very essence of God? The Spirit sees love, love, love. grace and forgiveness, beauty and truth. Now here's the miracle Paul tells us, that as we sacrifice our needs, as we humble ourselves and are willing to die to our own needs, Christ gives to us his Spirit, and we begin gradually to think more like Christ. Paul says at the end of chapter 2, we have the mind of Christ. It's an amazing thing. What does it mean to have the mind of Christ? You wind up doing loving things, really without even thinking about it. I was listening to this guy this past week, a fellow by the name of Drew. He said that it was his senior year of college, and this girl comes running up to him and said, "I saw you and I just wanted to say thank you." He said, "Thank you for what?" She said, "I wanted to thank you for making a profound impact on my life." And he said, "How did I do that?" She said, "When I was a freshman, I came here to school together with my parents, and I didn't want to join the school. I didn't want to register. I thought I did at one point, but when I got here, I was scared. I wanted to go home, and I told my parents in tears that I wanted to go home. I met with them in their hotel room, and they said, well, just give it a day, go to registration, and if registration, you get there, you meet some people, and you decide not to register, then that's fine, we'll take you home." She said, "On that day, you came up to me. I saw you coming out of the student union building, and you were wearing this goofy, foolish-looking hat. It was wonderful. And as you were wearing this hat," she said, "you came up with this lollipop in your hand. And you looked at this boy who was standing beside me in the registration line, and you gave him the lollipop. And then you said to him, 'You see this beautiful woman next to you? Why don't you give her the lollipop?' And he did. He was kind of awkward, and we all kind of laughed. But he stood there and handed me the lollipop. Then you said to my parents, 'Look, she's away from home for one day, and now she's taking candy from a stranger.' But she said, that moment, you just broke us all up and made us laugh and made us relax. And I decided at that time I would stay here in school. That was 4 years ago, and this was the best decision I ever made in my life. And you helped make it happen. Thank you." Drew goes walking off, and she said, "Oh, and by the way, that boy is now my boyfriend." 4 years later, Drew got an invitation to a wedding from that couple, and he went. And the most amazing thing about this, Drew says, he doesn't even remember giving her the lollipop. I think that's the way it is with love. I mean, we all have our lollipop moments, and it can make a real difference in our lives. We're the giver or we're the receiver, but it makes a profound difference. And I think sometimes we start thinking, well, for true love to be true love, it has to be immensely sacrificial and deeply profound. But the profundity of it all is that when we just die to self on a daily basis and open ourselves up to the mind of Christ, then living the life of love just becomes a natural expression of who we are, because it's an amazing thing, we have the mind of Christ. That makes all the difference in the world. Scriptures tell us, they teaches us, page after page, love everyone always. I don't know about you, I can't do it. At least I can't do it on my own. But Paul says there's help. It comes from Jesus, from the cross, and from his Spirit. May we open ourselves up to the power of God this day and always. Let us pray.